In 1991, with the publication of her popular book, The Beauty Myth, Wolf became a leading spokesperson for the new generation of feminism known as the Third Wave. Subsequently, she went to publish a slew of much-talked-about books, from promiscuities to misconceptions to Fire with Fire to her most recent book, Vagina, A New Biography. Tonight, she will be in discussion briefly with Liz Topp, co-writer of several books, including Vagina, An Owner's Manual. Topp is also a guest lecturer on vagina literacy at local New York high schools. Please join me in welcoming Naomi Wolf and Liz Topp. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I wonder, Liz, I'm wondering, I think when we're sitting down, do people have difficulty seeing us in the back? Liz, how would you feel about sort of standing up?
Sure.
And then we can sit down when we get tired. But
okay.
That way,
or maybe perch.
Or perch,
yes.
Yeah. We can perch, exactly. Very good. How's that? Is that better? All right. I think we're happy.
Yes.
Are you comfortable?
I'm happy.
We can perch, we can lounge, we can take ownership of the space, right? Because that's what this is all about.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's an honor. It's a real honor. I'm so delighted to be here for so many reasons. One is the role that the Strand plays as a benchmark of independent bookstore-ness and as a community center in my neighborhood. And the other is Liz Topp, who is actually one of the heroines of my book and who inspired me in a lot of ways to write Vagina because of her book Vaginas, but also of a documentary that she did about the G-spot. And we can talk a lot more about that, but it was when she was describing how some women she interviews absolutely are certain that there's a G-spot and other women are absolutely certain that there is not a G-spot. That opened up a whole lot of questions for me, and she just is just a real inspiration. So let's go. So what Jessica Strand, who introduced us, has suggested is that we talk for about 15 minutes and then open up the floor to a discussion because everyone has thoughts, questions, comments. So Liz, do you want to go ahead and maybe we should each sort of talk about what led us to the work that we're doing about this.
Sure. I wrote the book Vaginas, An Owner's Manual with my mother, who is an OBGYN, years ago. And what really brought me to it is that I realized after sort of growing up in New York, attending a good private school, having friends who really had access to all sorts of information and resources, they just couldn't quite figure out where to ask questions about their vaginas. So for me, growing up with a gynecologist, that was dinner table conversation. And I found that most of my friends all of a sudden really wanted to come to dinner at my house. So we wrote the book, and I thought, oh, like vaginas, 51% of the world has a vagina. Like this is going to be great. And I remember going to sign books the first time, and the two women that worked at this nice independent bookstore uptown said, oh, we had your book displayed, but someone threatened to call the police. And this actually happened several times on our book tour, and it was shocking, where we would go places and it was very much still a taboo, and even getting people to say the word seemed to be a real stumbling block. Right.
I was very impressed with the announcer downstairs, yes. Vaginas, because it's hard for many people. Yes.
Oh, they would not announce our book at all.
Right.
And radio and television, I remember talking to a television producer, and they had just done a show on a book that was about how men can maintain firmer erections with the power of nutrition. And I said, well, you have to do a show on vaginas now. And she said, well, I just don't think our host is comfortable with the female counterpart. So I did this book with my mom, and then I thought, well, obviously the next step is to go to high schools, as I went to high school in New York, and talk about this with the sort of age group that inspired me to do the book. So I called it Vagina Literacy, and I actually had an entree because the nurse at my high school was the same nurse that I had. So she turned out to be this really hip, you know, when you're in high school, all adults look kind of fuddy-duddy. But as an adult, I realized she was the super hip older woman who gave me free rein to talk to juniors and seniors. And for 4 semesters, I went and talked to these 17 and 18-year-olds, and I would go into the room, and all the boys were so excited and positive and smiling and ready to talk to me. And a lot of the girls were just like, oh my God, I can't believe that we're gonna talk about this. And I would ask for a volunteer to draw a vulva on the blackboard, which 100% of the time were boys. And once this, you know, drew the vulva, and a girl raises her hand and she says, well, I thought the clitoris was on the bottom. And, you know, everybody's just sort of like what's right? And I'm like, it's on the top, it's right here. And then I would talk about anatomy and health, you know, UTIs, function, basic stuff. And the most interesting part of the class were the anonymous questions, which I think is what ultimately led to the class being canceled once the administration found out what was going on, which is, of course, ironically, the self-directed part of the course, the part that they're just bringing their questions. And that was, of course, the best part. You know, the class was very, you know, I'd teach for 4 sections, and the first section had the right number of people, and the second section had about 50% more students, and by the 4th time, you know, it was standing room only.
What were some of the questions that you think led to the class being canceled?
Well, the first question I ever received was, what is your opinion of faking an orgasm? Which is a good question. It is a good question. Right? Yep. I mean, I was like glad they had somebody to ask, and I was glad that I could say, you know, this isn't science, but my opinion is that it's a bad idea. Because if you tell someone you are in an intimate relationship with that you enjoy something, that you like something that you don't like, you're just going to keep getting something you don't like. So, and then the second question that I received, and I think it was this type of question that really just didn't go over very well with institutional guardians, was, is it possible for a woman to have an orgasm during anal sex without direct clitoral stimulation? It's pretty advanced for a 17-year-old, which I pointed out. I was like, you know, you guys really should walk before you're running. You know.
But you think that was, the administration thought, you know, enough of this, let's just close down this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it feels like a hot potato, and I think people have the misconception that talking about sexuality, talking about anything but STDs, safe sex, you know, this sort of scary negatives is like
an open door.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
so Liz, so those of you who've read the book know that I have a 4-inch metal plate in my lower spine, so I'm going to stand up because it's a little more comfortable. And then I'll sit down periodically. So shall I now do my riff, and then we can get into the back and forth? So Liz, you know, as I mentioned, was an inspiration, and what really stayed with me was her description, and it's at the end of the book, of these high school students that she was teaching, you know, struggling with so much ignorance, and then having the very place that was supposed to educate them shut down the education right when it was getting somewhere. And then this anecdote she told about how these girls in this school finally realized that they had to kind of assert their right to everything positive that owning the vagina represented, and so they asked permission to go to the school assembly, and they stood up, and then in unison they said vagina, vagina, vagina. And to me that was just such a wonderful anecdote because, you know, by the end of Vagina, A New Biography, my book that came out recently, it was so obvious to me what these girls intuited at 16, which was that it's not just about a sex organ. It's not just about sex. The way that one is allowed to own or not own the vagina, name or not name the vagina, claim or not claim the vagina, the status that a society assigns the vagina or the mockery assigned to the vagina is a trope for female self-respect or lack of the right to self-respect, female identity or the lack of right to identity. So I'm going to touch very quickly on some of the main points in the book, especially some of these I want to touch on especially because there's been a lot of very fiery, critical, I wouldn't call it discussion, reaction. You know, I want to be present to answer any questions you may have about it. Most people who read the book, everyone who reads the book says that they don't recognize the book in the critical eruption that attended its publication. So I just want to touch on the main things, and you know, then I love to open it up for discussion. So I knew I was going to write a book about the cultural history of the vagina, as I mentioned. But then I had a medical crisis that led me to add some amazing discoveries that I had no idea about. In a nutshell, what happened was that I had a spinal injury. And I'm going to be very, very brief about this. Very briefly, the injury, the symptoms dialed down my sexual sensation, but I became aware that they were also dialing down states of mind, positive states of mind that I had associated with how I felt after lovemaking. And these were, you know, states of mind that had to do with feeling energized, feeling good about things in general, feeling confident, feeling like things connected. And you may not notice these if you've never had it taken away, but as my symptoms worsened, I became aware of something that neuroscientists call anhedonia, which is a lack of pleasure in the world, right? Things looked bleak, colors looked flatter, there was kind of a depressive quality to everything. You know, what's the meaning of it all? And then when I was treated and cured, basically, my sexual sensation returned, but so did my mind states that I thought I had lost. And this was such a vivid, you know, documentation, eyewitness experience of a brain-vagina connection that no one explains to us, that the brain and the vagina through the spine are a single sort of neurological system, essentially, and that there's this profound influence that the vagina has on the brain, and vice versa. So in the 6 pages in the book where I tell this story, those are some of the 6 pages that critics have been most freaked out about, because we can talk about this in the Q&A if you like. It's very taboo for a woman to say, you know, to claim any interest in pleasure or desire, let alone to speak in the first person about her vagina in public. And it's not easy to do. I very much didn't want to include the story because I knew it would lead to a, you know, social eruption. But as a journalist, finally, you know, I wrote 2 versions of the book without it. As a journalist, finally, I realized I had no journalistic integrity if I didn't include it, because your first question, reasonably, reading the book, would be, what led you to this? At that point, I'd have to either lie to you or tell the truth, and I never lie to my readers. So that experience led me to research unbelievable discoveries in the last 10 or 15 years about this brain-vagina connection. And very quickly, you know, one of the headlines of the New Science shows, to me, explains patriarchy and its relationship to female sexuality, this fear and hatred that you've described and that, you know, you can see in my history section is a constant for 5,000 years. When a society supports a woman in knowing about her own sexual pleasure, knowing how to make it happen, and allows her to anticipate good sexual experience, whether it's by herself or with a partner, whether she's lesbian, bisexual, or heterosexual, or whatever, that anticipation of pleasure boosts dopamine in her brain. And dopamine is an incredible neurotransmitter. I call it the ultimate feminist neurotransmitter because it goes to confidence, focus, motivation, risk-taking, trusting your own judgment, assertiveness, sociability. Cocaine is a dopamine enhancer, and shy people become very, sure of themselves, very assertive, very talkative. So when you realize that pleasure for women boosts dopamine, you really get it, why the vagina has been mocked, ridiculed, targeted, suppressed, controlled, in some cultures mutilated, for 5,000 years. Pleasure does make women insubordinate. Pleasure does make women harder to control. And this is, like the top of my head lifted off when I realized that, after enough interviews, that this was a real thing that explains so much, in my view, of human suppression of female sexuality. It also boosts opioids when you have an orgasm, which is about ecstasy, transcendence. These are not my words, this is in the scientific literature. It boosts oxytocin, which is about trust and connection. And so when you understand this potent, like, neurochemical, delightful mixture that happens to the female brain when women are allowed to have pleasure, know about their pleasure, you understand why so many positive mind states, why it's not just about a sex organ, why we misunderstand the vagina, thinking of it as just a sex organ. Pardon me. Another set of amazing discoveries from the new neuroscience really explain another big mystery. 40 years after the quote-unquote sexual revolution, after the Height Report, we live in a hypersexualized society in which information, quote-unquote, about female desire is available everywhere. But the numbers for female sexual happiness are not so good. In fact, they're kind of shocking. 30% of women don't reach orgasm when they want to and define it as a problem for them in their terms. That figure hasn't changed from 1976 and the Height Report. And another 30% of women, some the same women and some different women, self-report as a problem for them that they have low libido, they're not interested, it's not happening for them. And when I did the research I offer readers in Vagina, I now again understand that, because our basic narrative about what female desire and arousal and orgasm are is wrong. It's 40 years out of date and really wrong in some key respects. One of the ways it's wrong is that Masters and Johnson said men and women have similar, sort of the same arousal cycle, arousal, plateau, climax, resolution. In fact, women's arousal is very, very different from men's. And even down to the level of neural wiring, and we can talk about this in the Q&A. And another huge difference has to do with the role of the autonomic nervous system in female arousal. And I'll just explain that and then I'll stop, because I know there's so much more we want to say, but there's lots more. But so very briefly, the autonomic nervous system plays a key role in female arousal. It's the thing in your body that when you're getting excited, if you're a woman, boosts your heart rate, sends the blood flowing through your body, makes your skin more sensitive, engorges your inner and outer labia. By the way, Liz and I are kind of talking about vagina in a not technically accurate way, because the vagina technically is just the introitus, the part inside your body. But she and I, and I applaud this, obviously, because that's how I use the term. Well, I'll speak for myself. I'm talking about it to include the clitoris, the labia, the introitus, the perineum, the whole sexual nexus of women. But anyway, when that blood is flowing through your body, it engorges the inner and outer labia, it helps the clitoris become erect, and it also goes to lubrication. So it's really, really important for arousal for women. But what stops the autonomic nervous system? Does anyone want to hazard a guess? Stops it in its tracks from this kind of delicious activity. Fear, absolutely, and you could also say stress. And so there's this incredible data about documenting how when you know, if your partner snaps at you at 7 o'clock in the morning and then wants to make love at 7 o'clock at night, you're not a bitch or withholding if you can't just switch gears. Your body actually stops that process until you feel that you're without bad stress. There's a role of good stress in female sexuality, which we can talk about in the Q&A. That's why 50 Shades of Grey is a bestseller. But bad stress definitely, you know, kills desire. And so again, to me, this is a feminist insight, because if it means that if you want a woman enthusiastically to want to make love to you for the rest of her life, you have to be nice to her for the rest of her life and partner with her in the things that stress her out. There are a number of other incredible discoveries, but I'll stop and either talk more or go to the Q&A depending on what time it is, which I can't actually see. 7:30. So should we chat more or go right to the Q&A? Chat more. Okay. So Liz, let's talk about your G-Spot movie. What was the most surprising thing you found out interviewing all these women about female sexuality? And is there a G-Spot or isn't there from your point of view?
Okay, I'll start there. The thing about the G-Spot for me is that I think that we like to sort of tart up some basics, like you point out in your book. I believe that the G-spot is probably part of the clitoral network. It may also have something to do with the urethra. The discovery of the G-spot, the G in G-spot, is Ernest Grafenberg, who wrote an article in 1950 that was titled "The Role of the Urethra in Female Orgasm." So, you know, I guess I just don't believe, you know, that there's a unicorn in your vagina. It's, you know, it's your clitoris or your urethra, or, you know, something we probably know about, and that there's no need to like look around for some, you know, new exciting thing that's exciting enough. The most I think interesting thing that I discovered was more in the film's reception, which we were talking about right before we came out here, that even though I had been through this whole thing with the vagina book and people calling the police and just sort of a lot of surprising negative response and coming up against the taboo and talking to students and then having sort of that avenue shut down when it was becoming very fruitful, and obviously students were very interested, and ultimately submitting it to a women's network. And it was very, you know, nice that the president of the network got back to me, because she said, you know, this is so fascinating. What a great topic. Unfortunately, it's almost impossible to find sponsors for shows like this. And if you wanted to do a movie about rape, that wouldn't be a problem, but nothing about female pleasure.
A women's network.
A women's network, which I'm gonna, you know, leave nameless, but a women's...
There's only one.
Yeah, well, at the time there was actually more than one. Okay. And maybe that's why they may not be around anymore.
Right.
But I think just to underline the point of this sort of, again, taboo quality of female sexual pleasure, I remember I was talking to these students, and a lot of the questions I would get were specifically about female orgasm and just sort of, you know, how do I know if I'm having an orgasm, and how do I have an orgasm, and do you have any tips for masturbation, and just sort of really searching inquisitive questions, to the point where I remember in the first class I taught, this boy raised his hand and he said, well, I don't know, I thought sex was for boys.
Wow.
And, you know, it wasn't like everybody in the class had that kind of response. It was like,
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like sex is kind of for boys, which I think is the misguided impulse to think that talking about it opens doors as opposed to, you know, provides empowering information so that you make choices based on a sense of, you know, self, and a sense of I'm in this for pleasure for myself. And since it is more complicated for women, I think this is a very important point we agree on, that it's complicated. It requires more, you know. There is something to it. To have a satisfying sexual relationship as a woman, I think, is a little bit harder than having a satisfying sexual relationship as a man. That might require a little bit more, and you might lead to better choices. You know, I don't know that talking about sex with young women makes young women have more sex.
Actually, the data show that it makes them have smarter sex. I mean, more responsible choices. That the thing that guarantees pregnancy and STDs is ignorance, or sex ed that stresses, you know, death and STDs and warts, and never talks about pleasure for girls, because then what they often say they experience when there's actually a critical moment to say, I want this and not that, or use a condom or use contraception, is a feeling of being swept away. It just happened. But now we know, one of the mind-blowing pieces of research in Vagina explains that when women, documents in a lab, that when women reach orgasm, they actually are being swept away, in a sense. This is another one of these incredible pieces of data. Yannick Georgiadis and his team found that when a woman has an orgasm, and this is one of the things that I think some feminists had a hard time wrestling with and kind of wanted the data to go away, but it's not a very, in my view, grown-up response to want data to go away instead of sort of dealing with it. When a woman has an orgasm, a part of her brain that has to do with self-consciousness and self-control goes quiet. And I see a lot of heads nodding. You know exactly what I'm talking about. And so this is, I would say, all the more reason to equip young girls with a way to stay conscious as much as possible before that moment of unconsciousness makes, you know, where's the diaphragm? I'm not even thinking clearly, you know. And to me, what was fascinating as a literary critic about that study is that I had noticed that there are all these scenes in 19th century women's fiction of the heroines being swept away by a flood or by a storm or by some giant natural force right after a scene of sexual temptation. So fascinating. Did you have a question for me, or should? Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would say what was you've talked about a lot of things that have surprised you, but in doing this research, other than your own personal revelation, which I imagine is surprising just on a totally different level.
Yes.
When you set out on this journey, what was the most surprising thing you uncovered?
The most surprising, thank you for asking that, because it goes to your point about complexity. So I thought, you know, I'm not naive, and I'm really interested in sexuality, and I follow, you know, information and discussion about it pretty carefully, but I had no idea what women look like on the inside from a neural perspective, and it is an absolutely mind-blowing revelation. And I hope all of you, whether you buy the book Vagina, a New Biography, and you should definitely buy Vaginas, a user's manual, an owner's manual, because it's incredibly useful, and you should buy them for your daughters too, and your sons as well. But there's a reference to two Netter images, which are medical illustrations in the book. And whether you buy my book or not, go look online, okay? One of them shows, male pelvic innervation. And it's fascinating because it shows the nerves coming out of the base of the spine, and then they wrap around the penis in a grid, a very regular grid. And I often joke, it's like a map of New York. You know, there's north and there's south, and you know where you are. It's not complicated. But what this means is that, well, of course, men are different, and they all have different needs and wishes and childhoods and so on, the things that make men happy sexually, mechanically, are quite similar. Whereas, I'm hand gesturing, whereas if you look at the Netter image for female pelvic innervation, it's a complete revelation. It is like Sao Paulo at Mardi Gras. You've got to imagine 8 or 9 tangles of beautiful Christmas lights, right? And they're crazy wild all over the place. And these are neural termini. So some of them terminate in the clitoris, we know about that. Some terminate in, anatomists have found, can you hear me if I talk like this? Anatomists have found a new neural structure, going to your point about the G-spot, at the anterior of the female pelvis, such that the north of it is the clitoris, and the south of it is what we call the G-spot. But it's not two different things. It's one structure, right? It's one neural structure. And the huge information about this is that 90% of women in lab conditions with strangers reach orgasm when both of these points are stimulated at the same time, compared to the numbers that we mentioned before. That alone, I think, is worth the $10, price of admission for this evening. I'm getting so many emails about this piece of information, by the way, from men and women. It's happy news. But others terminate at the mouth of the cervix. Barry Komisarek at Rutgers has found a new sexual center for women at the mouth of the cervix. Some terminate in the walls of the vagina. Masters and Johnson said there's no sensation. It's not true. Some terminate in the perineum. Those of you who've had children in America probably had this neural terminus cut for episiotomy. It's standard for childbirth, and I'm now starting to think that the high numbers of postpartum dissatisfaction with marriage correlate to the cutting of this neural center. I know, it's like people's eyebrows are shooting up, I know, but these neural termini are so important, but the amazing thing is that every woman is wired differently. You won't see the illustration in the book, you'll see a reference to where you can find it online in the book, but you'll see descriptions of it. And so since every woman is wired differently, it means that every woman has to learn herself very attentively, and ideally with this map in mind, because you don't learn anything about it from porn or, locker room conversations. And anyone who loves a woman has to learn her very, very, very attentively. But it's revelatory to me because there's all this judgment about our responses, and is it cultural, and was I scolded by the nuns in 3rd grade? It could be cultural, it could just be the special, unique quality of your unique, special neural wiring. So that was one. And also I just have to say, knowing what that looks like, so many readers have said it's transformed their relationship to their own bodies, that they're able to find ways of experiencing pleasure that they thought they would never have, or that they wouldn't know about, or they hadn't known about. It's just incredible what a map will do.
I have another question.
Yes, please.
Okay, so towards the end of your book, you provide some advice, I think, to really heterosexual men towards keeping the woman happy so that you can have a good sex life, basically, and how all of the complicated things that you describe throughout can be synthesized to have this, good sex life.
I didn't put it that way, but go on. I'm not reducing it, but go ahead.
Summing it up, but if you could turn that sort of prescriptive lens out to the world and have a manifesto based on what you uncovered.
Right. What would it be?
What would it be?
Oh my God, that's such a good question, Liz. And again, Liz was very much of an inspiration because she teaches sex education. She kept referring in our interview to things women need that men don't need. And she said, I think I remember you saying it's got a lot of hyphens between it. Things women need that men don't need, And this is a really important category, but because females' desire and pleasure are so devalued and we don't talk about them enough to tease out the nuances of them, we don't really have that category, let alone sort of all the endless subcategories that we need. So there is this prescriptive section in the book. It's the only prescriptive section in the book where I coined a lighthearted shorthand that has really infuriated a lot of people, the goddess array, and I stand by it because one of the things I did find in my journey to discover who is making women really sexually happy and what does that look like, the women who were truly sexually happy that I found generally shared some sense of radical self-respect about the vagina and their bodies and female desire. So I use that shorthand, the goddess array. So what I do in that section is I map out basic Tantra 101, which in my research I found to be very, very, very effective for women, who are not orgasmic, becoming orgasmic, who were not having great orgasms, having incredible orgasms. But again, with our theme of it's not just about orgasms, it's not just about pleasure, I have stories in there of women being awakened through these practices, going from living in their parents' home and attracting bullying men and not writing what they wanted to write to, yes, now they're having all kinds of different and more amazing orgasms, but they moved out of the house and they got a job as a director of communications and they're writing a novel and they're, attracting really supportive men. So I'm sorry, I'm digressing. To answer your question, what I offer is only where Tantra maps up with actual Western science. And there are a number of places that it does, and it's quite incredible. And I can't reduce it to a manifesto because sexuality is so complex, and I wouldn't want to. But I don't know how to put this. I said at the conclusion of my last big talk about this that this book is really about love, whether it's love for yourself, well, starting with love for yourself, love for the people around you, whether you're in a sexual relationship with someone else or not. And I guess I just keep thinking about oxytocin. If you stroke a woman for 10 minutes, her body releases 10% more oxytocin. Men's bodies don't have the same reaction. And oxytocin is about closeness, about love, about connection. And so I would definitely say, what is clear is that many women, I don't want to speak for women, what is clear from the neuroscience is that women thrive in an atmosphere in which they feel cared for, caressed, stroked, supported, loved, attended to. I'm not saying people can't be kinky and, play all kinds of games. I'm not saying that, but that this is a fundamental thing that we're primed for. And I guess the other thing I would say is time. In our culture, if you time, clips on porn.com or whatever, they're getting shorter and shorter. And the thing about these tantric workshops that I went to is that these women were having life-changing experiences, and the men were given the instruction, you give her a sacred spot massage for an hour and a half. And nothing for you, it's just all about her, right? And I'm like, an hour and a half? Do these people not have jobs? Do they not have children? It's like, this is a huge time commitment. But Mike Luzada, who's this sexual healer in Britain who has these incredible outcomes, said that the average man takes 4 minutes to reach orgasm, the average woman 16. So there's already something not working for women if they're under time pressure. Many women's autonomic nervous systems get stressed out by time pressure, right? Oh, is he going to get bored? Or is she going to get bored? Is it, and then there was something about, for women, knowing that the directions were that they're just to receive, right? That absolutely was transformational for them. Partly, I think, because so many women, about 30%, have experienced sexual abuse or sexual assault at some point in their lives. So there was something very healing for these women about being told, your job is simply to receive pleasure. It seems really unbalanced, this model of sexuality, but I interviewed a lot of, so categorically, just to conclude, it seems clear in heterosexual relationships, and we should talk about others as well, that putting the woman in the center of what's happening, which is the tantric message to heterosexual couples, is really effective. And it's effective psychologically, it's effective emotionally. It seems not fair to men, but I interviewed men who did this, and they said the most beautiful things about why it was worth it to them, actually really valuable to them. They said things like, well, they reiterated that you don't learn anything about women from, the locker room, but they said things like, who doesn't want to feel like a hero? And they said men are process-oriented, and they want to know that they're getting it right, And then one man said, who doesn't want to be around a really happy woman in the morning? So it does seem as if, and many people in long relationships, I've heard from 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 80-year-olds in passionate relationships, and the men all said, when the woman's happy, everyone's happy. So that would be my distillation of that section.
I'm all for that. And I would just add that I really enjoyed the prescriptive part of the book,
Thank
and
you.
I commend it to all of you.
Thank you.
And my boyfriend's going to read it.
Thank you very much. I get a lot of confidential disclosures from women that they're going to talk to their partners about their autonomic nervous systems. Yeah. So let's open it up now for discussion. There's, I'm sure, so much to talk about. Yes, please. Is it okay if I pass around the...
Yes.
It seems like you interviewed a lot of women. How did you get, did they write to you, or did you just go straight to them and talk to them? I'm curious.
Yeah. So did everyone hear the speaker? Yeah, so she asked, how did I choose the women that I interviewed? So some of them I invited to respond to specific questions in my Facebook community. So that's not a scientific random sample, it's self-selected. Some I'd be like covering a tantric retreat, and I would ask people if I could interview them, men and women. Some were people with specific experiences, like clients of Mike Luzada's that I wanted to interview. Some were women with specific problems, like vulvodynia, that I asked their counselors to put me in touch with so that I could interview them about that. Some were women who'd had specific kinds of vaginal trauma, like going to Sierra Leone, a very dangerous journey in 2006 when it was still where we were in rebel-held territory during the just after the conflict there. And I interviewed refugees in a refugee camp who had been horrifically genitally mutilated in rape. In other words, and that was a big insight, that there are many parts of the world where women are not just raped in war, they're raped in a way that fucks up their, creates terrible injuries to their vaginas and clitorises. And in our Western model of rape, and we haven't talked about rape or porn, but both of those are big parts of my book. In our Western model of rape, it's always an individual psychopathology, but when I was seeing this systematic assault to injure women vaginally in Sierra Leone, I realized there's something more to this. It's not a bunch of psychopaths. Some of the people delegated to do that were children, who had been kidnapped. And then I had, it fit together so well with this insight I had about dopamine, that when you injure these women, you're interrupting that dopamine loop. You're literally, what happens to the vagina happens to the brain. And people who support women with female genital mutilation are using my book to make the case that it's not just about diminished sexual sensation, as bad as that is. It's about tamping down all the things that make life meaningful and make resistance possible. Yeah. Yes, please. Do you want to stand up and shout into the mic?
So I guess I just have a question about when you said when women have babies in America,
So when women have babies in America, let me try to get this to you. They have what's called an episiotomy very often. It's standard of care. Nominally,
well, I already
was that the question? So the question is why does this happen, or what is it?
Do people know about it? Why isn't anybody stopping it? Why does it only happen in America?
Right. I mean, this is such a great question, and all of these things go to what Liz has so eloquently been saying about the devaluing of female bodies, but especially female pleasure. So in America, you can read my book, Misconceptions, about this. It's about childbirth. In America, there's a money value in giving birth really quickly because it's a for-profit system. So they don't want you to labor as long as labor takes the way they do in Europe when it's not about the money. Since they're speeding up your labor, they give you Pitocin, which is a chemical form of oxytocin to speed up contractions. That sends the baby sort of violently coursing against your perineum. And in Europe, the midwife might do genital massage with olive oil to slowly open the perineum. Here, that's considered too sensual. I tried to propose that, during my second child's birth, and the nurse looked at me like I was an absolute pervert. Yes, but I knew that it would save me from an episiotomy. But anyway, so what happens is that women tear when the baby's coming too fast because of these pressures, or else to avoid tearing, they're given an episiotomy, which just cuts the perineum. So one reason that no one screams and yells about this, I mean, there are birth activists who don't like the episiotomy rates, for sure, and who don't like these practices. But the ignorance that we have about the actual anatomy of female sexual pleasure is so vast that people don't know that there is a sexual center. I didn't know. I mean, but anatomy, like you talk to the doctors I interviewed, they're like, physicians don't know. Gynecologists don't know. So people are just cutting the sexual centers of women. And then and then you kind of get it, why the rates for unhappiness when you take the baby home and when you're recovering from this really major, like, what would it be like? It would be like, I don't even want to think about what it would be like for a minute. It's so horrific. But, even if we understood it, like, we understand what it means to perform a clitoridectomy or an infibulation, and still, this is not at the top of the list of things that we're upset about, because female desire is devalued. Female sexuality is viewed with total ambivalence. And I talked to Natasha Walter, who champions women refugees in London. She says most of the refugees there are running away from assaults on their vaginas, whether it's child rape or infibulation, but that judges who give asylum don't take these reasons to run away seriously, because they're just sexual. They're just about female sexuality.
And I will just add, I think one of the problems is that there's no real sphere of ownership, I think, in the scientific community, in medicine, for female sexuality. Gynecologists frequently don't really like to talk about it, don't necessarily get educated in it. It's not necessarily part of their practices. And they have to sort of carve it out for themselves if they want to be experts specifically on sexuality, as opposed to just anatomy and function.
That's right. That's true. Yes, please.
I really loved what you were saying about the ATS.
So she's going to give you a microphone so you can say that nice compliment even louder.
I'll try to make a cohesive sentence. I really liked you were saying about the ATS, the automatic ANS. And I am a woman that's in menopause, the same partner, and the concept of opening oneself to a man who's, if you have a rather large man and it's the same relationship, but then all of a sudden, postmenopausal, you're closed to the man who has never really been one to do all the compliments or the hours of stroking, where once, it was like almost like ejaculate towards this person. Now it's like completely closed, and feeling like my vaginal system is so small as I get older, whereas before I felt like a different woman sexually.
Yeah, I want to speak to this, and I'm sure you have something to say to it too, right?
This is a little bit peripheral to the audiences that I usually speak to, but I know that it's very, very common, and that, my mom actually says sometimes about vaginas that they are a little bit use it or lose it.
So I'd like to speak more specifically, and first I just want to applaud your courage, because you asked a really important question that many people, I'm sure in this audience, care to know the answer to, and this is exactly the kind of conversation we should be having, because ignorance is so gigantic. So what you're describing is something that's very common postmenopausally, which is it's harder to get to lubricate, and the tissues are what's called more friable. They can be actually injured more easily. So things that would have been manageable with, what you're describing, a large partner, before that transition it can be painful. It feels like you're getting smaller. I don't know if that is actually true, but you're definitely less able to accommodate, especially if he's not doing those strokey, lovey, complimenty things in advance. So what I want to say is there are many good ways of approaching this, and I'm not just going to look at you. I'll look at everybody. I know. So one thing that is really important is good lubrication.
Absolutely.
You can buy great lubrication. I recommend Good Vibrations or Babeland. The other thing that some gynecologists recommend is hormone replacement therapy. That's very controversial. I'm not going to endorse it or not endorse it. You can talk to your doctor about it. It's not just kind of use it or lose it. I've now heard from many postmenopausal women, and it's categorically, and I've also heard from people who study this, categorically use it or lose it. And specifically, to my astonishment, I was at the 92nd Street Y talking to Gail Saltz, a doctor, and she said, nobody tells older women that they need to masturbate, and not just masturbate, but insert something inside themselves while they're masturbating to keep the tissues functioning well, lubricating well. Categorically, female libido and sexuality decline if you're having painful or negative experiences, which is the risk of this.
My gynecologist actually is selling, insertables and vibration things at his gynecologist. He's a classic Jewish, Hasidic culture too. And
interesting.
And I thought your book, by the way, was very great.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So the takeaway is use it or lose it. I want to say that Jim Faust has found that female rats will stop initiating or even being responsive to sex if they have 4 or 5 negative sexual experiences. So really, that's why you can't stay in a relationship with someone who doesn't make you, I don't mean to be prescriptive. It's dangerous to your body to be with someone who doesn't treat you well. It's dangerous long term. And the last thing I would say about this, I'm sure you agree, is communication. If someone isn't doing what you need them to do as your body changes, whether you're pregnant or older or younger or whatever, or traumatized, which is a very common thing, with women who've had sexual assault, please try to communicate with that person, which is why sentences like "my vagina" are so important to habituate us with communicating, and please consider, that environment. Yeah. Yes, please.
Oh, just really briefly, you'd mentioned something about good stress versus bad stress. So in line with what you were, and I'd be interested in hearing more about that.
Oh, me too. Me too.
So I'm just curious to what it is what kind of stress enhances rather than depresses.
Right. Yeah. Do you want to hazard a guess? I'm sorry, I'm not putting you on the spot. You're blushing. I'm sorry, you're blushing. No, I shouldn't do that. So I can tell you. So 50 Shades of Grey is a gigantic bestseller, and Nancy Friday's book, My Secret Garden, showed that, submission or dominance and submission, or bondage, dominance, and submission fantasies are very, 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 very common for women. As a feminist, this can be a little freaky because, the orthodox feminist view is we've internalized our subjugation. But I learned differently that, well, 2 things. So bad stress is when you can't control what's happening to you, right? And you're scared or you're stressed. Good stress is when you can control absolutely everything and you ramp up the drama or the escalation of the scenario. And what I mean specifically, I talked about the autonomic nervous system, right? So in a rape fantasy, for women who find that a turn on, very different from a rape, okay, which is bad stress, pain, fear. We haven't even talked about that, but my chapter shows that there is no such thing as nonviolent rape. Any rape can rewire your brain from the trauma of the fear of it in measurable ways. But going to when you're totally in control, it's a fantasy. Then good stress, meaning, say imagining, well, I don't even need to go into it, imagining the spanking or the, being, whatever, handcuffs, you can fill in the blanks. Kinky. What it does is it turns up that autonomic nervous system response, right? That bit of, what's going to happen now? And so for many women who have a low baseline autonomic nervous response, imagining or experiencing that spanking or that hair pulling or whatever just ramps up their heart rate to shoot them over the edge in a way that gives them that little extra push that they need. So it could be psychological masochism, or it could just be how your autonomic nervous system responds. So it might not have any political or psychological thing at all. The other thing that occurred to me especially when I've been having experiences like Liz about people not, my book's title was censored on Apple ebooks, and other things about, whopping great porny things were not censored on ebooks. I mean, the censorship is just on and on and on. In a culture in which it is so hard to think about female desire and to think about it the way my book seeks to help you think about it from the inside out rather than, being constructed against you or with you, I think a lot of women feel comfortable really exploring their fantasy life or their pleasure, their desire, if the scenario is, he made me do it. Because then they're not a slut. Right? They haven't provoked it. They're not going to be punished for it. I mean, like really punished as opposed to fun punishment, right? So I think that's part of the appeal of books like that. Good stress.
Yeah, and I would just second the good stress versus bad stress thing. And I think one of the reasons why we both shy away from being too prescriptive is because, we're all unique, and that's a major point of Naomi's book is the nerve system that she describes it's not the same like a stamp on every woman. It's vastly, vastly different. So, you just have to figure yourself out, which is, again, part of what makes it so complicated. There's no, one size fits all.
Yes, please. In the back, yeah.
Here.
Thank you. Well, you mentioned the mediated age that we live in, the digital age that we live in, and I feel that young women are kind of exploring their sexuality a little more just together, like through these digital networks like Tumblr. I see posts and posts and posts and posts from like 16, 17, 18-year-old girls, like of guys performing fellatio on them and them feeling like really pleasured. And I'm wondering, what do you think as far as the future? Do you think there's going to be a collective like consciousness of this woman that you said puts her vagina on a pedestal and thinks that way and feels really strongly about the power of her vagina? Do you think that the digital age that we live in right now will help take us there, or do you see media kind of having a backlash against that? What do you think is really going to happen? I mean, you would know.
Can I ask you a question before you give up the mic?
Sure.
Do you find these images empowering to you? Do you feel like they are empowering or not?
I do. I just think the act of exploration is empowering. The fact that young women are paying attention to those things and tuning into those things, and it's not just about, okay, my boyfriend is here and I'm getting laid. It's like, wow, I really like this thing. This turns me on. I like to visually see it, and I will post 100 pictures of it on my account because I think it's amazing.
Like you're seeing, like they're identifying.
Their friends are seeing. They're showing it to their friends.
Oh my God.
Like, and this is what's being circulated around. That's what I wanted to bring up, because I'm really curious to know if you think that a conscious shift is happening, if this could really be achieved. This type of woman that you're describing, who does think about herself and her sex in that way, could this really become a phenomenon, especially using these like digital networks to do such? I know there's like the porn side too, and I feel like I have a lot of friends who rely on porn to, just get them through whatever. But at the same time, I'm still wondering if we can tune into ourselves in that way. And do you think that will occur and will just evolve?
So thank you. Can you hear me if I speak like this without the mic? Yeah. So to me, that scenario you described, just because it's happening doesn't necessarily mean it's empowering. Doesn't necessarily mean it's disempowering. I would want to know more about what these girls say and think, and because I just wrote a piece about how girls are being cyberbullied after they've had stuff like that get out on their social networks and committing suicide. So it could go either way. I'm definitely noticing the death of privacy among the idea of sexual privacy among young people. I was in Houston, and apparently all the boys and girls got in trouble because the 13-year-old girls were going down on the boys under the table at the bar mitzvahs in Houston. So, and this is, I'm hearing stories like this every single day across the country. And definitely porn, people who counsel teenagers say porn is definitely a factor. Middle schoolers think, for instance, that you're a loser if you're monogamous, because porn has multiple sexual partners. So my take on the influence of porn, as you can see in the porn chapter, is I think it's highly high. I think there are risks that people need to know about having to do with brain science. So definitely in any community where women are exploring, if they're exploring voluntarily, that's always good, I think, right? I'm not going to censor any kind of exploration. I think it's always useful. However, what I'm really worried hearing from young people more and more that they rely on porn to get them through, as you said. I mean, I think the human body and human sexuality is so potentially radical and transformative that I don't like that this giant industry, which is like a $100 billion global industry, has so colonized people's brains that they can't turn each other on anymore, even if they're young and healthy, without it. And very specifically, now we know why. The data is in for men. This is why half my audiences are often male, and why men buy this book for their sons and their male friends. The male brain is being rewired by masturbation to porn. When men masturbate to porn, over time, and it doesn't take long, what happens to their brain is called habituation. And so they become desensitized by the images, which means they need more and more extreme kinds of images to get that same level of arousal, and more novelty, that clicking through thing. And it also means that over time, neurochemically, they're bonding with the porn instead of bonding with their partners, right? The oxytocin thing. Also, because of the habituation, their partners start to look less attractive to them and be able to arouse them less. And finally, over time, men start to report healthy young men, healthy middle-aged men with no organic reason to have sexual problems are reporting an epidemic of difficulty with erection, not being able to sustain erection, and delayed ejaculation, which is a euphemism for they can't come. And it's a huge problem. I mean, I had no idea how big a problem it is. I wrote this chapter, and I'm just inundated with men and women saying, you know, I'm trapped. It's also happening for women to some extent because girls are growing up masturbating to pornography, but the data is not as clear about the habituation. So to me, what's more important is choice, right? To me, this is a public health issue, not a moral issue. And I think men deserve disclosure about the health risks they run with this imagery. And I do believe that being able to unplug and dehabituate, which takes about 6 to 8 weeks and is very uncomfortable because it's like a withdrawal from an addiction, people do say that they become resensitized, re-aroused by their partners, and also emotionally resensitized, which is very, very interesting to me. So I would always vote for more sensitivity with a human being, less colonization by technology, because I think that's more revolutionary.
I would just add that the problems that I see with porn are in the places I talk about this stuff is that it's being treated as educational, right, not entertainment.
And what are some of the downsides of that? I can talk about anal fissures.
Right. Well, I think that's the anal sex question that I got from 17-year-olds was definitely derived from watching porn and seeing, you know, a lot of anal sex. That's done in a way to be entertaining, not realistic. Mm-hmm. So that's one problem. And as far as exhibitionism goes, I also wonder about privacy, and I wonder about what kind of intimacy is possible in the absence of privacy.
That's interesting. Yeah. Yes.
Have you in your research come across any correlation between women's sexual personalities, things that turn them on, and their individual vaginal configuration, since there's, they say, 7, 8, 9 different designs, if you will, some bigger, some smaller, different shapes, and it's reported that, some people have reported that, well, if she's got this particular type, then she'll like this type of sexuality, and they try to find a correlation between the personality and the shape of the vagina.
Goodness. I mean, I have to hand it to you. This is the first time I've had that question.
I have a book on it.
Me too.
You have a book on it. Wow.
And it's detailed.
And it's detailed. Well, you will be teaching us more about this, no doubt. But when you were talking, I was mentally smiling because other cultures think this way a lot more than we do. In Muslim culture, actually, in the Renaissance, the equivalent of our Renaissance, there was this beautiful book that was translated by Sir Richard Burton that has like 48 different kind of categories of vagina, and the Kama Sutra categorizes women into deer woman and elephant woman, and all these different women based on their vaginas, and it's like this one is moist and this one is hot and this one is this very attentive. I mean, I think it's very sweet because it's very, very, very close attention, as opposed to us, we tend to treat it like Twinkies, they're all the same, they're produced in a factory, and so I have never heard the Kama Sutra, and 600 years ago, Tantra did say that certain personality characteristics in women go along with different types. I think that's not, I have seen no science on it, so in my method of never saying anything unless there's science, I think it's an open question. There, my feminist instinct really is, I don't want to be reduced to a type, exactly. So that's what I would have to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I would only add to reiterate that I don't know that it serves a purpose necessarily to break us into types that map to other qualities when it's so complicated that it's like you're your own snowflake.
You're your own snowflake, exactly. That's a beautiful metaphor. And but just out of respect for your curiosity, I do love some differences between male and female approaches. It's such a mysterious thing. So many men I interviewed, when I said, "What do you think about the vagina?" They're like, "It's so mysterious. It's bedeviling. What worked last time doesn't work this time." And I can see the male heterosexual desire to just like, "Oh my God, give me a handbook,"
Yes, I want to understand.
Like the Audubon guide too, right? Yeah. Yes, Kate, you had a question?
This is the last question. Okay.
So, I think that I'm interpreting your book correctly when I say this, but if I'm not, you may correct me. It seems that you're going beyond saying that orgasm is one of the ways that women receive dopamine, that it's one of the things that makes us confident and creative and, positive. And it seems that you're going beyond that and saying that it is a necessary element for a woman to have orgasms in order to feel creative and confident and to be like fully experiencing their human female experience. And I was wondering if you think that, or if you would rule out the possibility that there might be like someone who does not have orgasms, either because it's impossible to fix medically or because they can't afford to fix it medically, whether there might be something like special in that if that does not exist, another sense might be heightened, in the same way that like blind people, like I would not want to be blind, and I think that would be very sad, but they have their own heightened senses. Like they experience, the sense of hearing in a totally different way that people who can see never would. And I would wonder if you would, say that it's, because it seems that you're saying that it's necessary.
Okay, so I'd love to speak to that because Thank you so much, Kate, for asking that question, because this is actually a very common, I would say, a very common misreading of my book. I can understand, especially because many of the reviews drew that conclusion, that you might take that from my book. It's absolutely not my message. So categorically, dopamine is one, having an orgasm is one important way women get dopamine. You can get dopamine all kinds of different ways. Categorically, I think, sexual pleasure is really important and has many benefits that I've identified that are neurochemical, but other things are also really important and have many benefits, like making music or creative work of various kinds, or exercise creates all kinds of positive brain chemicals and so on.
Chocolate,
absolutely. And yet I do want to say something about what you've said, because it's also very interesting to me that many of the emails I'm getting and letters are from women who have lost one kind of vaginal sense, if you like, for medical reasons or other kinds of injury, and learn how to gain other kinds of sensation. For instance, one woman who thought she would never feel close to her husband again after she gave birth to 2 big children and had the kinds of tear that we described, said that she used my book to find her quote-unquote sacred spot in the bathtub, and that she said she felt like a plug, a giant electric plug from the universe got plugged into her body, and that she followed the sort of guidelines in that prescriptive section, and she said she had the most kind of transformational experience of her life with her husband, whatever, but she said she was so grateful because she thought she'd been injured in other ways. So yeah, the human body is very, very, very adaptable. And there's another section that got misunderstood where I said that these things are so complex that people who are undergoing, for instance, transgender surgery, I think they deserve a whole book of their own because it's so complicated. Like these things are so complicated. I just saw science that shows that there are straight men in terms of visual response, there are bisexual men, there are gay men, different categories in terms of mapping, the erotic video to what's happening in the brain. But women's sexuality doesn't work like that. It is fluid. However, there's no such thing as heterosexuality for women, because women are getting aroused to lesbian imagery even when they're saying I'm heterosexual. But one fascinating difference is transgender male to female people keep a male brain even though their genitals have been reconstructed as women. In other words, they're having either heterosexual responses or bisexual responses or gay responses, but their vaginas are not doing what biologically born female vaginas are doing with that brain. So that's incredibly complicated, and what I tried not to do was be reductive in the book. Everybody deserves all of this research. There are people who are born without vaginas, and I think they deserve their own research. So there are many, many, many variations, and I absolutely don't want to, limit or tokenize or diminish the complexity of, this whole huge range, but categorically no, there is not just one way to relate to one's sexuality. There's, the intention of my book and the way people, I hope, read it is that it is intended to say wherever you are, whoever you are, these are things that you can learn from, but they're not, they're not one size fits all, as you say. They're, take it or leave it. If you go carefully through the book, and I really want to say this because I want to write a whole essay about dualism and how hard it is for people to read a set of questions in a non-prescriptive way if it's about sex. There is only one section of the book that's prescriptive. Everything else is, here you are, make of this what you will, Yeah.
I would just add to that.
So thank you for that question.
Yeah, that it's, again, so super common, and that we call, there are estimates that range as high as 10% of women have not had an orgasm, and we call these women pre-orgasmic because it just hasn't happened yet. And I think that that's one way to think about it, and the way that you described it, while I also don't have any science to back up the idea that other senses grow more robust in the absence of orgasm, I mean, I think that's a very positive way to think about it as well.
Can we have a final question? Just one, because I know this lady in the front has been very eager to ask a question. Is that okay?
It's really just a comment. Listening to you speak from the beginning of your talk, I just want to say thank you, because listening to you and having your research brought to us and listening to your affirmation just makes me feel normal.
Makes you feel
normal.
Oh, how wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's a very kind and gracious of you to say it. And you weren't sent here by my relatives to say it, so thank you so, so much. I appreciate it.
Where is Cher Height?
Where is Cher Height? I don't know. She's in Europe somewhere, right? No, she's not in America. Well, sadly, we have to close, but if you have additional questions, Liz and I will be over there, or at least... Yes, wonderful. And please remember to buy and recommend Liz Topp's incredible book. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to Ribalta for a drink after this and sort of inviting everyone and whoever's watching on whatever this is, which is around the corner. So thank you all so, so much, and enjoy everything that you are. Thank you.